Tonight, something quiet happened in Washington, but its consequences may be anything but quiet. Last week, 5 Republicans broke ranks. They voted to restrain Donald Trump's war powers in Venezuela. For a moment, Congress looked alive again. Then the phones rang, the pressure mounted, and 2 votes disappeared. On Wednesday night, the Senate reversed course, a 51-50 vote, broken by Vice President J.D. Vance. With that single procedural move, the resolution died. No final vote, no public reckoning. What remained was something far more dangerous, a president with effectively unchecked authority, and a legislature that blinked. This is not just a story about Venezuela. It is a story about power, how it bends institutions, how it tests principles. If you care about how democracies erode quietly, this story matters. Stay with me, because to understand how this happened, we have to start with what Congress was trying to stop. What lawmakers were reacting to was not theoretical. It was immediate, and it was explosive. The Trump administration had carried out a surprise operation in Caracas. U.S. forces bombed radar targets. American personnel were placed on the ground, and Nicolas Maduro was captured and brought to the United States. Yet Congress never voted to authorize a war. There was no formal debate, no declaration. That gap is the heart of this conflict. Under the U.S. Constitution, war powers are shared. The President commands the military, but Congress decides when the nation goes to war. The resolution before the Senate was simple in spirit. If the President planned major military action in Venezuela, Congress had to approve it. Supporters weren't blocking defense. They were defending process, drawing a line between emergency action and open-ended war. And for a brief moment, that line held. But to see why it collapsed so fast, we need to step back into history, into precedent. This struggle didn't begin with Venezuela. It is part of a long American pattern. Over decades, Congress has slowly surrendered war powers, not with one vote, but with silence, with shortcuts, with fear of political cost. From Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, presidents learned the same lesson. Act first, ask later. The War Powers Resolution was meant to stop that drift, a guardrail after Vietnam, a promise that no president could slide into war alone. But guardrails only work if lawmakers use them. In the modern era, military action rarely arrives labeled war. It comes as operations, strikes, limited engagements. That ambiguity is the mechanism. It allows presidents to expand authority while Congress debates semantics. So when U.S. forces struck Caracas, history was already leaning in Trump's favor. The system was primed. And then came the first real test, a moment when pressure met principle. The pressure hit fast, and it hit personally. After the Senate voted to advance the War Powers Resolution, Donald Trump erupted. On social media, he lashed out, calling Republican supporters ashamed, warning they should never be elected again. Then the private calls began. Trump phoned the senators directly, angry, yelling, berating. One call with Todd Young was described as very heated. It didn't go well, a source said. This was the first crisis point. Not missiles, not votes, but raw presidential pressure. For lawmakers, the calculation shifted. This was no longer about constitutional theory. It was about survival inside their own party. And Trump's message was clear. Cross me on war powers, and I will make it personal. Yet publicly, something else happened. A door opened. A justification appeared. Because just as the pressure peaked, the administration offered reassurance. And that reassurance would change everything. This is where the story turns from confrontation to compliance. The turning point came wrapped in procedure, not force, not law. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sent a letter, carefully worded, legally soothing. He promised no active duty troops were on the ground in Venezuela. He promised Congress would be notified. He promised adherence to the Constitution. And with that, the mechanism revealed itself. Power was not restrained, it was deferred. The administration did not deny the president's authority. It reframed it: temporary, conditional, procedural. For Josh Hawley and Todd Young, this was the release valve, a way out without confrontation, a way to trust the executive branch on its word. Rubio even went further. If the president planned major hostilities, he would seek authorization, circumstances permitting. That phrase matters because circumstances are defined by the president. This is how modern war powers expand, not through declarations, but through assurances. Congress doesn't lose authority in one vote. It lends it out, one exception at a time. And once lent, power rarely comes back. The next vote would make that painfully clear. Then came the vote that mattered, not on war, but on procedure, a point of order, technical, easily overlooked, and devastating. On Wednesday night, the Senate moved to block the resolution entirely. No final debate, no up or down decision. The vote was 51-50, perfectly split, until Vice President J.D. Vance walked in and broke the tie. With that single moment, the bipartisan effort collapsed. The resolution was ruled ineligible. Fast-track authority was gone. This was the second crisis, quieter than the first, more dangerous, because nothing visibly dramatic happened. No tanks, no speeches, just a rule. And suddenly, the check on presidential power vanished. Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski held their ground. But it didn't matter. Trump didn't need persuasion anymore. He had the numbers. He had the system. And once again, the president won. Not by expanding authority openly, but by preventing Congress from even voting on limits. This is how control is secured in modern politics, not through force, but through process. And now the consequences move outward, away from the Capitol, toward the people who always feel it last. Now shift the lens, away from senators, toward you. Because decisions like this don't stay in Washington. When leaders avoid calling something a war, it doesn't make it less real. It just makes it less accountable. You pay for it, through taxes, through inflation, through risk carried quietly. If conflict expands, there is no clear vote to point to, no moment where the country said yes. Rand Paul called this what it is, a game, an elaborate ruse played on the American people. War without a name, authority without consent. And that matters for the military too, because service members deserve clarity. They deserve honesty about where they're sent and why. When Congress steps aside, the burden shifts downward, onto soldiers, onto families, onto citizens who inherit the consequences. This is the emotional cost of procedural politics. If you believe democratic consent still matters, this moment should trouble you, not because of Venezuela alone, but because it shows how easily oversight disappears. And if you're feeling uneasy, you should be, because the world is watching. And what happens next doesn't stop at America's borders. The signal sent abroad was unmistakable. The United States demonstrated that a president can act militarily, face brief resistance, and then watch that resistance dissolve. For allies, this creates uncertainty. Who speaks for America? The president or Congress? For rivals, it creates opportunity. If congressional oversight can be neutralized at home, it weakens the credibility of restraint abroad. Commitments look conditional. Limits look flexible. Military action in Venezuela doesn't exist in isolation. It sits inside a global system already strained. Every strike, every deployment ripples outward. Other powers study the process, not the rhetoric. They see how pressure works, how procedures can be bent, how institutions hesitate. This is how norms erode internationally, not when laws change, but when enforcement fades. And once erosion begins, it rarely stays local. What started as a debate over war powers becomes a lesson in how democracies manage force, or fail to. And now we arrive at the hardest question, not what just happened, but what happens next. Because the future is not one path, it is several, and each carries a cost. There are three paths forward from here. None of them are clean. The first is the optimistic path. Restraint holds. The administration limits action. No escalation. No prolonged conflict. Congress stays passive, but events stay contained. This is stability by luck. The second path is more likely. Operations expand gradually. Advisors become assets. Assets become deployments. Still no formal war. Still no vote. The public learns in fragments, after the fact. This is how endless wars begin, not with speeches, but with normalization. Then there is the darkest path. Escalation triggers retaliation. Regional instability grows. The US is pulled deeper. And Congress, having surrendered leverage early, finds it has none left when it matters most. These are not predictions. They are structural outcomes. Systems behave the way incentives push them. And right now, the incentive is clear. Presidential power expands. Legislative oversight contracts. History tells us what happens next when that imbalance goes uncorrected. The final question is not about Trump alone. It is about whether institutions remember their role before the cost becomes irreversible. And that brings us to the end, where responsibility finally lands. What happened here should not be misunderstood. This was not chaos, it was design. A system where pressure overrides principle, where procedure replaces debate, where accountability dissolves quietly. Donald Trump did not seize war powers. Congress stepped back from them. That distinction matters, because unchecked authority doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with votes you never see, rules you never read, and decisions labeled temporary. If this episode teaches us anything, it is that democracies don't collapse from attacks. They erode from compliance. Venezuela is the stage today. Tomorrow, it will be somewhere else. And the question for you is simple. Do you notice when power shifts hands, or only when the consequences arrive? If you want to understand how modern wars begin, how institutions fail without drama, and how citizens lose consent without being asked, then this conversation cannot end here. Follow this series. Share it with someone who still believes oversight is automatic, because it isn't. And in the next video, we'll examine what happens when presidents learn that Congress will always blink first.